Billionaire disguised as a homeless beggar asked for leftovers. What the black waitress did left everyone frozen. A ceramic bowl explodes against brick 6 inches from Andrew's skull, drenching his borrowed jacket in cold tomato soup, while Andrew stands paralyzed by the smell of food he could easily buy the entire restaurant chain to obtain. It introduces Andrew as the tech visionary whose algorithms fill social media feeds worldwide, yet who feels a stubborn gap in his chest because every person he has loved has treated him like a stock portfolio. This deep emotional void drives his decision to disappear into the rainy night as a man with nothing. 3 weeks before the soup hit the wall, Andrew had watched Melissa arrange spreadsheet cells with the precision of a surgeon. Column A, dates of their relationship. Column B, gifts received. Column C, estimated market value. Column D, her emotional labor hours. The formula at the bottom calculated her ROI. "You're not even angry," she'd said, scrolling through 18 months reduced to data points. "That's the problem, Andrew. You don't feel anything real." He'd wanted to argue, but the words died somewhere between his brain and his mouth. She was right, in a way. He felt something, just not what she wanted. Not what anyone wanted. The memory dissolved into an older one, the kind that never fully healed. He was 9 years old again, sitting at the long table in Mrs. Patterson's group home. She'd given him 2 extra chicken nuggets, her hand warm on his shoulder as she smiled. "Growing boys need their strength," she'd announced loudly. The social worker had written something in her notebook, nodding approvingly. The next day, when no one was watching, Mrs. Patterson's hand had been cold as she'd taken those same nuggets off another boy's plate and given them to her own son. Andrew had learned the lesson: kindness had an audience, and when the audience left, so did the kindness. Now, standing in his penthouse 40 feet above the city, Andrew stared at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glass threw back an image he barely recognized: expensive haircut, tailored shirt, a face that had been called handsome by people who'd Googled his net worth first. Behind him, the city glittered with a million lights, each one representing someone who would smile at him differently if the numbers in his account suddenly disappeared. His phone buzzed with another dating app match. The woman's profile mentioned "successful men" 3 times in 2 paragraphs. He didn't bother opening it. The stubborn gap in his chest widened, that hollow place that billions couldn't fill. Every relationship had followed the same pattern: attraction, discovery of his wealth, a subtle recalculation of interest, then love that felt like a business transaction. Even his friendships carried the weight of what he could provide: connections, investments, opportunities. Andrew made his decision standing there in the dark, his reflection watching him with eyes that had stopped believing in human goodness somewhere between the group home and the boardroom. He would become invisible. He would strip away everything that made people see dollar signs instead of a man, and he would find out if there was anyone left in the world who could look at nothing and still choose mercy. The thrift store clerk had barely looked at him as Andrew paid cash for clothes that smelled of mothballs and someone else's hard times. A jacket with a torn lining. Jeans that had been patched at the knee. Shirts that had faded from too many washes in cheap detergent. He'd worn them home in a taxi, ignoring the driver's disgusted glances in the rearview mirror. For 3 days, Andrew lived in those clothes. He didn't shower, didn't shave, let his hair grow greasy and unkempt. He practiced walking differently in front of his bathroom mirror, shoulders hunched, eyes down, making himself small in a way that felt like erasing himself 1 inch at a time. He studied YouTube videos of people experiencing homelessness, not to mock, but to understand the weight they carried in their bodies, the way society's rejection became physical. On the 4th morning, he rode the subway to the Golden Fork. His Golden Fork, though Richard Castellano's name was on the manager's office door and the staff had no idea that Andrew Nicholson owned 51% of the restaurant through a shell corporation buried under 3 layers of LLC paperwork. He'd purchased it 2 years ago as an investment, attracted by its prestigious reputation and upward revenue trend. He'd never thought about what that reputation cost. The front entrance gleamed with brass fixtures and a doorman who'd opened doors for Andrew a dozen times before. Today, That same doorman's lip curled as Andrew approached. "Service entrance is around back," the man said, not quite meeting Andrew's eyes. "If you're looking for work." "I'm just," Andrew started. "Around back," the doorman repeated, harder now. His hand moved toward the radio on his belt. "Don't make me call security." Andrew walked around the building, each step confirming what he'd suspected. He passed a couple in designer clothes who instinctively moved to put more space between them and the dirty man. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something Andrew couldn't hear but could imagine. The service entrance smelled of grease and garbage. Through the door, he could hear the kitchen's chaos, shouted orders, clanging pots, the sharp sizzle of food hitting hot oil. His stomach, genuinely empty now, cramped with hunger he hadn't let himself feel in decades. A prep cook noticed him through the window, nudged the sous chef, and Andrew watched his test truly begin. Victoria Beckham's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the service station, watching the scene unfold through the kitchen's order window. The sous chef had grabbed a ceramic bowl, one of the expensive ones they used for French onion soup, and was advancing toward the service entrance where the homeless man stood. She should look away. Should focus on her tables, on the elderly couple in Section 3 who were ready to order, on the businessman in Section 5 who kept snapping his fingers for more water. Should think about Marcus at home, probably attempting to make lunch with one functional hand, his medical bills stacked on the counter like a paper tower of debt that grew taller every month. Friday. Tuition payment due Friday. $300 short even after she'd picked up every extra shift the schedule allowed. Don't even think about it. Tricia materialized beside her, following Victoria's gaze. Richard sent out a memo last week. No feeding vagrants, no handouts, nothing that compromises our image. You want to keep your job, you keep walking. Victoria nodded, but her feet didn't move. Through the window, she watched the sous chef raise the bowl. Watched the homeless man flinch but not flee, as if he'd stopped expecting better from the world. Watched the soup arc through the air in slow motion. Then she saw his hands. They were the wrong kind of dirty. Clean under the grime, nails trimmed despite the ragged clothes, skin that spoke of recent downfall rather than long-term destitution. Her mother had taught her to notice hands before she died. Hands tell you who's been knocked down versus who was born on the ground, she'd said, her own hands worn smooth from 20 years of cleaning other people's houses. These were hands that had fallen. Recently. Hard. Victoria's mother's voice echoed in her memory, "We don't get to choose what life takes from us, baby. But we always get to choose what we give." Marcus needed his medication. Needed his tuition paid. Needed his sister to keep this job that was grinding her into dust one double shift at a time. But Victoria had watched her mother die with nothing except her dignity and the knowledge that she'd never looked away from someone else's suffering just because she was suffering too. If Victoria looked away now, Marcus would still be disabled, the bills would still be unpaid, but she would have become someone her mother wouldn't recognize. She made her choice. Victoria didn't announce her decision. She simply moved, plating a full meal with hands that had stopped shaking the moment she'd decided. Roasted chicken with herb butter, garlic mashed potatoes still steaming, glazed carrots, a side of the fresh sourdough bread that cost the Golden Fork $4 a loaf. She used her own meal allowance, the one free shift meal staff were permitted, and added it to a real plate, the heavy white porcelain reserved for dining room service. Tricia grabbed her elbow as she pushed through the service door. "Victoria, don't. Richard's in the building. He's doing his rounds." "Then I'd better hurry," Victoria said, and surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. The homeless man was sitting against the wall now, soup dripping from his hair, his borrowed jacket dark with the stain. He looked up as she approached, and Victoria saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise, then suspicion, then something that might have been hope if hope hadn't learned to hide. "Here," Victoria said, sitting down on the concrete beside him, ignoring the cold that seeped through her uniform pants. She held out the plate. "You look hungry." He stared at the food like it might disappear. I can't. I don't have money. I'm not asking for money. Victoria set the plate in his lap. I'm asking for your name. James, he said after a pause that lasted too long, and Victoria knew immediately it was a lie. She didn't call him on it. Everyone deserved their secrets. James, she repeated, as if the false name was sacred. I'm Victoria. And I need you to eat this before my manager sees, because I'm pretty sure I'm about to get fired, and I'd like to know it was worth it. He picked up the fork with those clean dirty hands, and Victoria watched him eat. Not the desperate shoveling of someone truly starving, but slowly, deliberately, as if each bite was a meditation. His eyes tracked her as she was called away to table 3, watched her navigate the dining room with practiced grace that disguised the fact that her shoes had holes in the soles and she'd been standing for 9 hours straight. Between refilling water glasses and taking orders, Victoria noticed James noticing things. The way she discreetly pocketed 2 dinner rolls from the bread basket a patron had barely touched. The exhaustion she tried to hide behind her professional smile. The moment when she stumbled slightly and caught herself on a chair back, invisible to everyone except him. When she returned to collect his empty plate, he said, "Thank you," and the 2 words carried the weight of something larger than gratitude for food. "We're all just trying to survive," Victoria said, and meant it. Sometimes that means helping each other survive too. She stood, brushing concrete dust from her uniform, and walked back inside without looking to see if Richard Castellano had witnessed her violation. Behind her, James sat very still, staring at the empty plate as if it contained answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask. Victoria's canvas bag, 10 years old and stitched together in 3 places, chose that moment to surrender. The bottom split as she pushed through the service exit at the end of her shift, and her life spilled across the concrete in a cascade of paper and desperation. Past due utility bill, $347. Red stamped warning about disconnection. Prescription receipt for Marcus's anti-seizure medication, $280. Insurance denied, appeal pending. A small spiral notebook fell open to a page covered in her handwriting, 2 columns of numbers that told the story of survival mathematics. Income on the left, shift wages, tips calculated down to the penny, a weekend cleaning job she'd picked up. Expenses on the right, rent, Marcus's medical supplies, groceries reduced to rice and beans, her own meals crossed out entirely with a note that read, "Skip, save $40 per week." She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather everything before the wind scattered her humiliation across the alley. Her face burned despite the cold. This was the poverty she worked so hard to hide, laid bare on dirty concrete. "Let me help." James was there, his hands, those wrong kind of dirty hands, reaching for papers before she could protest. "Don't," Victoria started, but it was too late. He'd seen the prescription, was staring at Marcus's name and the medication's impossible cost. Was reading her budget notebook where she'd calculated how many meals she could skip before her body stopped functioning. Their hands touched as they both reached for the utility bill. Victoria looked up, ready to see pity or disgust or that particular expression people wore when they realized just how poor you were. Instead, James was looking at her face with an intensity that made her forget about the scattered evidence of her failure to keep things together. "Whatever happened to you," Victoria said, because someone needed to say it, because his eyes held the kind of pain that recognized hers, "It doesn't have to be forever. Sometimes we fall. But falling isn't the same as staying down." She'd meant the words for him, but they echoed back to her, and for a moment Victoria let herself believe them. James helped her gather everything, his movements gentle with her secrets. When the bag was full, contents pushed past the torn bottom into a knot Victoria tied at the top, he stood and watched her walk toward the bus stop. She turned back once, found him still standing there in the alley behind the Golden Fork, and something passed between them that had no name. An understanding, maybe. Or recognition. 2 people drowning in different oceans, both surprised to find someone else who understood that drowning wasn't giving up, it was fighting to breathe in a world that kept pushing your head underwater. The bus that would take her to the city's poorest district arrived, and Victoria climbed aboard. Through the grimy window, she watched James until distance and exhaust fumes made him disappear. She didn't know his real name. Didn't know where he came from or how he'd ended up soaked in soup behind an upscale restaurant. But she knew his hands told a story of falling, and she understood falling. What she couldn't have known was that James understood falling too, and that unlike her, he had the power to make sure she never hit the ground. Richard Castellano believed in aesthetics the way other men believed in God. He stood at the head of the staff briefing room, his suit tailored to emphasize broad shoulders and minimize the soft middle-age spread around his waist, and surveyed his kingdom of 18 waitstaff, for hostesses, and assorted kitchen personnel with the satisfaction of a man who'd climbed from sous chef to general manager through relentless adherence to a single principle: revenue is reality. "Let me be clear," Richard said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd memorized every corporate motivational book ever written. "Our clientele doesn't pay for food. They pay for an experience. And that experience includes aesthetic curation." He clicked to the next slide in his presentation. It showed the Golden Fork's quarterly revenue, up 12% year-over-year. On the next slide, customer satisfaction scores, 4.8 out of 5 stars. Then, a photograph of their dining room, elegant and pristine, where beautiful people ate beautiful food in beautiful surroundings. "This is our brand," Richard continued. "Premium dining requires premium everything. Premium ingredients. Premium service. Premium atmosphere." He paused, letting the word hang. "Nothing that disrupts that atmosphere can be tolerated." The staff shifted in their seats. They'd heard variations of this speech before, usually preceding new policies that made their jobs harder while making Richard look good to corporate. Effective immediately, we're implementing enhanced exterior protocols. Richard's smile was the practiced kind that never reached his eyes. "No feeding individuals loitering near our premises. No conversation with vagrants. No handouts, no exceptions. Our dining experience begins the moment clients approach our building, and we cannot have the aesthetic compromised by," he chose his word carefully, "urban difficulties." Tricia's hand went up. She'd been calculating this moment since yesterday, weighing risks and rewards, deciding that loyalty to management paid better than loyalty to coworkers. "Sir, what if someone already violated that policy?" Richard's attention sharpened. "Explain." "Yesterday, during the dinner shift, Victoria gave a full meal to a homeless man. Used a dining room plate, sat with him, the whole thing." Tricia delivered the information with the neutrality of someone reporting the weather. "I warned her, but she did it anyway." Richard's jaw tightened. He'd known Victoria for 3 years, model employee, never late, worked every holiday shift without complaint. But rules were rules, and examples were necessary. "Send her to my office after lunch service," he said, and made a note on his tablet. "Anyone else have concerns they'd like to raise?" The room stayed silent. 18 people who'd witnessed Victoria's kindness, and not one of them spoke up. They had rent to pay too. Bills stacking up. Children who needed school supplies and cars that needed repairs and lives that didn't allow for heroic stands against management. Victoria, sitting in the back row, felt the weight of their silence more than she'd felt Richard's words. She'd known this was coming. Had known it the moment she'd picked up that plate. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. "Good," Richard said, misinterpreting the silence as agreement. "Revenue is reality. Everything else is sentiment, and sentiment doesn't pay the bills." Dismissed. The staff filed out. Victoria stayed seated, staring at her hands, the same hands that had held a plate for a stranger, that had calculated impossible budgets, that had held her mother's hand as she died. She thought about Marcus at home, about Friday's tuition deadline, about the prescription she still couldn't afford to fill. Then she thought about James's eyes, the way he'd looked at her food as if it contained something more precious than nutrition. She stood and walked toward Richard's office, knowing exactly what was waiting for her there and choosing to walk toward it anyway. Richard's office smelled of leather and expensive cologne, scents designed to remind subordinates exactly who held power in this equation. Victoria stood before his mahogany desk, still in her uniform, her feet aching from the lunch rush, and watched him arrange papers with the careful precision of a man building a case. Victoria. He didn't invite her to sit. 3 years you've worked here. Excellent record. Never a complaint, never a violation. Which makes yesterday's choice particularly disappointing. I gave someone food, Victoria said, keeping her voice level. Someone who was hungry. You gave a vagrant our premium entree using company resources, violating health codes, company policy, and the explicit instructions I distributed the week prior. Richard slid a document across the desk. I'm offering you a choice, which is more than I'm required to do. Victoria looked down at the paper. Her hands, those hands that had seen too much, remained steady. Option 1, Richard continued, sign this written apology stating you exercised poor judgment that compromised the Golden Fork standards. Accept a 2-week unpaid suspension. Complete corrective training on company policy and brand protection. Return to work with a formal reprimand in your permanent file. 2 weeks unpaid. Marcus's tuition would be impossible. The utility bill would go into collections. The prescription would remain unfilled. Option 2, Richard said, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic in the way of executioners who believe they're being kind, immediate termination with cause. No unemployment benefits. No reference letter. You walk out today and that's the end of it. Victoria picked up the document, reading the words that would purchase her survival. I exercised poor judgment, compromised the Golden Fork standards, failed to prioritize company image, regret my unprofessional behavior. She thought about Marcus, 16 years old and brilliant, studying nursing so he could help other disabled kids like himself. Thought about their mother who'd cleaned houses until her hands bled so Victoria and Marcus could eat. Thought about every person who'd ever told her that survival meant compromise, that dignity was a luxury poor people couldn't afford. Thought about James's clean dirty hands and the way he'd looked at her with something like wonder when she treated him like a human being. I can't sign this, Victoria said. Richard blinked. Excuse me. I can't sign something that says treating people with dignity is poor judgment. Victoria set the paper down, and her voice carried the weight of 3 generations of black women who'd been told to bow their heads and kept their heads up anyway. That man was hungry. I had food. The math was simple. The math, Richard said, his sympathy evaporating, is that you have bills to pay. A disabled brother who needs you. A life that requires this income. Be reasonable, Victoria. I'm being reasonable, Victoria said. I'm just not being convenient. Richard's face hardened into the expression of a man who'd built his career on people choosing convenience over conscience. Then you're terminated. Effective immediately. Clear out your locker and leave your uniform. Security will escort you out. Victoria nodded, turned toward the door, then stopped. Sir. That man I fed. He said thank you like it was the first time in a long time anyone had given him anything without wanting something back. I'd make the same choice again. Then you're a fool, Richard said. Maybe, Victoria agreed. But I can live with being a fool. Can you live with being whatever you are? She walked out before he could answer, her head high, her heart breaking, her soul somehow intact despite everything. In his office, Richard Castellano made a note in his file about Victoria's termination, satisfied that he'd maintained standards and protected the brand. He had no idea that the man Victoria had fed owned 51% of everything Richard believed he controlled, and that storms had a way of arriving without warning, changing weather that people had mistaken for permanent. Andrew Nicholson stood in his penthouse wrapped in a robe that cost more than most people's monthly rent, staring at 6 monitors that displayed everything his resources could uncover about Victoria Beckham. His experiment was over, the soup had proved his cynicism correct, humanity had failed his test. Except for one person who'd chosen mercy when mercy cost her everything. Now he needed to know why. The first screen showed her employment history: the Golden Fork, 3 years, terminated yesterday for policy violations. Before that, 2 restaurants where she'd worked until they closed, another where she'd left for better pay. Perfect attendance. Glowing reviews. Goes above and beyond. Treats every customer like family. The second screen displayed financial records he'd accessed through methods his lawyers would prefer not to know about. Checking account balance, $847. Savings, $0. Credit cards maxed out, making minimum payments. Monthly income versus expenses formed a chart that showed Victoria drowning in slow motion, keeping her head above water through sheer force of will. The third screen hurt to look at. Marcus Beckham, age 16, born 3 months premature, cerebral palsy affecting his left side, seizure disorder requiring medication that cost $280 monthly. Their mother, Lorraine Beckham, died 2 years prior from complications of diabetes she couldn't afford to manage properly. Life insurance, none. Savings, depleted during final hospitalization. Victoria had been 23 when her mother died, suddenly responsible for a disabled teenager and medical bills that would have crushed someone twice her age. She'd never missed a single one of Marcus's neurology appointments. Never let his prescriptions lapse, even when it meant she wasn't eating. The fourth screen showed Marcus's academic record. Straight A's. Advanced placement courses. A scholarship application for nursing school he'd written himself, one-handed, about wanting to help other kids who society treated as broken. Andrew sat down heavily, the leather chair creaking under his weight. Victoria hadn't fed him out of pity or performance. She'd fed him because somewhere in the arithmetic of her impossible life, she'd decided that other people's hunger mattered even when she was hungry too. He pulled up a fifth screen, making calls that would remain untraceable. A pharmacy received an anonymous donation to fill any outstanding prescriptions for Marcus Beckham, signed, a grateful stranger. A nursing school scholarship foundation discovered a clerical error, they'd forgotten to notify Marcus of his full ride acceptance. Victoria's utility company recorded a payment from an anonymous benefactor, past due balance cleared. Andrew watched it all cascade through systems he understood better than he understood people, money moving through digital channels to create small miracles in Victoria's life. He imagined her confusion, her suspicion, her desperate hope that maybe luck had finally turned in her direction. The sixth screen showed him his own reflection in the darkened monitor. Andrew Nicholson, age 32, net worth $2.4 billion, owner of companies that connected millions of people through algorithms designed to predict human behavior. He'd coded systems that could identify what people wanted before they knew they wanted it, that could quantify friendship and monetize emotion. But he'd never predicted Victoria. Had never imagined someone would see through his disguise not because she recognized his face but because she recognized his humanity. Had never calculated that kindness could exist without transaction, that someone with nothing would give everything to a stranger. His phone showed news alerts about Victoria's termination. Richard Castellano had leaked the story to local media, framing it as a cautionary tale about maintaining standards. "We can't let empathy compromise safety," Richard had said in an interview. Andrew watched the video 3 times, his jaw tightening with each viewing. This was his test's final question: would he let a good person suffer to maintain his experiment? Would he let Victoria drown because pulling her out meant revealing that he'd been testing her humanity while disguised as someone who'd lost his own? 24 hours, he told himself. 24 hours to see if the world would right itself, if somehow Victoria would catch a break without his intervention. But even as he made that promise, Andrew was pulling up property records for the Golden Fork, reviewing Shell Corporation documents, making calls to lawyers who specialized in hostile acquisitions. Some storms, he was learning, needed to be created rather than waited for. The video went viral at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, uploaded by someone with an anonymous account and a talent for framing narratives. Grainy security footage showed Victoria bringing food to Andrew in the alley, sitting beside him, treating him with dignity that the internet immediately weaponized. "Waitress risks health violations for vagrant," read the caption. The comments section became a battleground. Some praised her compassion. Others demanded her arrest for enabling homelessness and spreading disease. Local news picked it up by morning, framing it as debate fodder. Where's the line between kindness and public safety? Richard Castellano appeared on 3 different morning shows, his media training evident in every carefully chosen word. We support compassion, of course. But we have protocols for a reason. Public health, safety, liability, these things matter. The Golden Fork maintains the highest standards because our clients deserve premium experiences. By afternoon, someone had found Victoria's address. By evening, her building had a small crowd of protesters, some supporting her, others calling her reckless. A brick came through her apartment window at midnight. The note wrapped around it read, "Stop enabling lazy criminals." Marcus called 911 while Victoria swept up the glass, her hands shaking for the first time since she'd made her choice. Andrew watched it all from his penthouse, footage playing across his monitors in a nightmare loop of consequences he'd created. His test. His experiment. His disguise that had put a target on Victoria's back while he remained safely hidden behind billions of dollars and anonymous shell corporations. 24 hours had passed. The world hadn't righted itself. Good people were drowning while bad people gave interviews about maintaining standards. Andrew made his decision. He shaved for the first time in a week, the razor scraping away his disguise. Showered until he no longer smelled of the streets. Dressed in the Tom Ford suit he'd worn to his last board meeting, charcoal gray with a crisp white shirt that cost more than Victoria made in a month. His reflection showed Andrew Nicholson again, the tech visionary, the billionaire, the man whose name opened doors that were slammed in James's face. The Golden Forks dinner service was in full swing when Andrew walked through the front entrance. The doorman who turned him away 72 hours earlier now held the door open with a bow. "Good evening, Mr. Nicholson." "Welcome." Heads turned as Andrew crossed the dining room. Patrons recognized him from magazine covers. Staff froze, confused by the presence of the majority shareholder who'd never visited during operating hours. Richard Castellano emerged from the kitchen, his media-trained smile spreading across his face like oil on water. "Mr. Nicholson. What an unexpected pleasure. If you'd called ahead, we could have." "We need to discuss your employment," Andrew said. The dining room went silent. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Richard's smile faltered, confusion replacing confidence. "I'm sorry. You fired Victoria Beckham 3 days ago," Andrew said, his voice carrying across the restaurant. "I'd like to know why." Richard's throat worked. "She violated company policy. Fed a vagrant using premium." "She fed me," Andrew interrupted. "I was the vagrant. And you threw soup at me, threatened me, dehumanized me, and when one of your employees treated me with basic human dignity, you fired her for it." The color drained from Richard's face. Whispers erupted across the dining room. Phones appeared, filming everything. "You told the media that empathy can't compromise safety," Andrew continued. "But what you meant was that empathy can't compromise revenue. That mercy has no place in a business model built on exclusion. That human beings can be sorted into profitable and unprofitable categories. Mr. Nicholson, I was protecting the brand. You were protecting your bonus." Andrew's voice was quiet, but it cut through Richard's excuses like a blade. "Effective immediately, the Golden Fork will undergo structural and cultural reconstruction. You're terminated. Your severance will be generous, because unlike you, I believe people deserve dignity even when they've failed." Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You can't, the board. I own 51% of this restaurant through a shell corporation. I am the board." Andrew turned to the staff, clustered near the kitchen, watching their world reshape itself. "Victoria Beckham will be offered a management position, if she chooses to accept it. And starting next quarter, we'll implement a new program, staff who volunteer at homeless services will receive full wages for those hours. Because mercy should never cost the merciful everything. He walked out of the restaurant into the night, leaving chaos and camera phones and the beginning of change in his wake. Victoria's apartment was in a building that Andrew's car service wouldn't normally visit, in a neighborhood where poverty wasn't aesthetic, it was survival. He climbed 3 flights of stairs that smelled of mildew and decades of cooking, and knocked on apartment 3C. Victoria opened the door, exhausted and weary, and saw him. Recognition flickered, something familiar in a stranger's face. Then understanding crashed over her like cold water. "James," she whispered. "Andrew," he corrected. "Andrew Nicholson. And I owe you an explanation." Victoria's hand tightened on the doorframe. "You were testing me." "I was testing everyone," Andrew said. "Testing whether anyone could see past money to humanity. Testing whether mercy existed without transaction. You were the only one who passed, and then you lost everything for it." "I didn't pass anything," Victoria said, anger rising in her voice. "I just fed someone who was hungry. And you had billions the whole time. While I was skipping meals, while Marcus needed medication, while I was being fired and threatened and having bricks thrown through my window, you were conducting an experiment." "Yes," Andrew said, because she deserved honesty. "And I was wrong. Not about testing people, the world failed that test exactly as I expected. But wrong to let you pay the price for my cynicism. Is that supposed to be an apology?" Victoria's eyes blazed. "You used me. Used my kindness like data in one of your algorithms." "I'm not apologizing," Andrew said. "Because I can't undo what happened, and words don't pay for broken windows or lost wages. But I'm offering you a choice. Not a job, not charity, a choice." "What choice?" "You saw me when I was nothing," Andrew said. "I'd like to see you, really see you, now that I know what seeing costs. I'd like to invest in Marcus's education, not because I pity him but because he's brilliant and the world needs more people who want to heal rather than hurt. I'd like to help rebuild what my test destroyed." "And what do you get?" Victoria asked. "What's your ROI on this investment?" Andrew smiled, sad and genuine. "Maybe I get to learn that not everyone operates on algorithms. Maybe I get to believe that mercy exists. Maybe I get to become someone worth the kindness you showed me." Victoria stared at him for a long moment. Behind her, Marcus appeared in his wheelchair, looking between them with the sharp intelligence of someone who'd survived by reading people quickly. "First," Victoria said, "you owe my brother an explanation. A real one, not corporate double talk. Second, you're buying dinner, at a restaurant with actual compassion, if one exists." Andrew's smile widened, something genuine breaking through years of calculated expressions. "I know just the place. I'm remodeling it." Marcus wheeled closer. "Is this the soup guy?" "Yeah," Victoria said. "This is the soup guy." "Cool," Marcus said. "Can his money fix the window? Because it's cold as hell in here." Andrew laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Yeah. I can fix the window. And a lot of other things, if you'll let me." Victoria stepped aside, letting him into their small apartment with its cracked window and impossible hope. "You mess this up, you disappear back to your penthouse, you treat us like another algorithm to solve, and I swear I'll make sure every newspaper in the city knows exactly what kind of person you are." "Deal," Andrew said. Behind them, 3 floors down and half a city away, the Golden Fork was already changing. Richard's office was being emptied. Staff were whispering about new policies, new possibilities, new weather that felt like it might last. And in a small apartment in the poorest part of the city, a billionaire who'd disguised himself as nothing learned what it meant to be seen by someone who'd never looked away from suffering, even when suffering wore a $1,000 suit and owned 51% of everything. The storm had broken. The weather was changing. And for the first time in his life, Andrew Nicholson believed that maybe, just maybe, mercy didn't require a transaction after all.